There we go. Thank you. Following council resolution where we were asked to look at or to consider rebates for our primary producer ratepayers recently. So tonight is really, I guess, I want to look at a couple of things. Like the previous finance working group, I want this to be quite an interactive discussion session rather than myself or Jade or Scott talking to these slides. But I want to start just by recapping at a high level a little bit on our rating, like how we determine total rate revenue, look at the change in the fixed charge that we took on, look at the relative contribution from each category and if that has changed, have a quick look at how valuations within a category can influence what an individual ratepayer may pay relative to other ratepayers in that same category. Then just do a recap on rates being a tax and what that means for rates being a tax. And then after we get through that part, hopefully quite quickly, just to then consider and explore each of the various aspects that were raised either by members of the public, one through deputation, or other queries that EMs have raised during the rating and budgeting process. And then we'll look at any implications that flow from these. So tonight's really about just exploring those, getting some information, and then we'll talk about next steps at the end of the session. Is everyone comfortable with that approach?
Well, I hope we can move through the explanation part fairly quickly and cut to the chase fairly soon. That'd be good.
Yeah, okay. I'll take that on board. Thanks, Councillor Bray. And if anyone else, if I'm going too quickly, please slow me down. If I'm going too slowly, please speed me up. With the first part, just a really quick recap on the rating process. So the first step that we go through is we look at what is our target net rate revenue that we want to be able to meet the demands of our budget. So we take the previous year's rate revenue in 2021, that was 133.6 million. We increase that by CPI, and that gives us a rate revenue target for the coming year's budget. So the 1.2% CPI rate increase was about 1.6 million, which meant that we're actually targeting 135.2 million from rate revenue. On top of that, we add in our growth, and our growth this year we assume to be 0.9%. It has been for the last couple of years, around 800 or 900 new properties each year. So that's where we came up with the 2.1%, the 1.2% plus 0.9%, an increase of 2.8 million in total rate revenue that we're looking to derive from our ratepayers, which gave us a rate revenue target for 2021-22 of 136.5 million. What we then do is what you can see in front of you there is the current way that we split the rates between our fixed component of 30% and our variable component of 70%. All we do in relation to increasing our rates is we just grow that pie by the $2.8 million that I just referred to. And traditionally, we've kept those splits fairly similar, that we've actually continued to target 30% fixed component and a 70% variable. This year, because of the Value General's revaluation initiative and the impacts that had on individual ratepayers in terms of the changing values and what that might mean for them being exposed to that variable component, we actually increased the fixed component to 42% and reduce the variable component to 58%, so that more of a ratepayer's rates they pay were based on the fixed and less was based on the variable. And that was a very deliberate strategy that we took you through and which you guys adopted to try and mitigate the impact of the large fluctuations in valuations.
The way that graph is drawn, Anthony, shows the change in fixed versus variable applying to the increase only.
Yes, it's not meant to show that, Martin. It's meant to show that our total rate revenue take was a 42% split and fixed and 58% variable. That's probably a bit of a clumsy chart in terms of the way the pie chart's done there, but effectively,
no, we moved from 30 to 42 basically. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. The next thing I just wanted to quickly recap was how we split the rates pie, if you like to speak. So In 2021-22, you can see on the inner ring there, we've raised 113.5 from residential, 11 from commercial, industrial, etc., etc. In 2021-22, by growing that pie out, all we did was simply maintain the relative proportion that each category wanted to or needed to contribute. And then, sorry, Justin's just entering the room, and then increase that proportionally across each category. So we kept the proportions that we wanted to be each category to contribute the same as last year. So we maintained those. In some instances, we may need to adjust that. And a good example of that, I guess, is where if we have large parcels of vacant land and a developer converts them into residential, we would actually consider then changing the proportion based on how we have, I guess, fewer vacant lots available, but more residential lots. And so we will adjust it from year to year, but we didn't feel that was necessary this year because we didn't have significant shifts in the numbers of properties contributing to each category.
And I guess therein lies the problem that we came up against, because primary production trying to maintain a similar indexed income with fewer primary producing properties gave us a bit of grief.
It did, Martin, but once we get into the detail, I'll show you that the impact is not as significant as some people might think it is. But that is part of the argument some people have put forward, and we'll explore what it means by having less primary producers, but still asking them to contribute to that same component of the pie. But more importantly, explore what happens within that category for the different valuations and how they play out for different ratepayers relative to each other within that category. So we're going to try and simply show that here. We've assumed very simply that, say, primary producers contribute 25% of the pie, and that we only have 3 primary producers contributing to that pie. So, and each of those 3 primary producers in the previous year have exactly the same valuation. So in that instance, you would expect that every primary producer, those 3 primary producers, would all contribute the same rates in a given year. What we had happen through the revaluation initiative was that some primary producer valuations went up significantly higher compared to the other primary producers in that category. What we're trying to show next is that assume, for example, that primary producer 1's valuation increased significantly relative to the other primary producers. They would be then expected to pay a much larger contribution of the total share that all primary producers would be contributing. So proportionately, the total category would contribute the same, but within that category, there would be shifts from some primary producer ratepayers to others based on their relative shift in their valuations. So does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is no different than residential.
No.
Correct. It happens the same. The only difference, Wayne, is that there's probably 2.5 there's 2,050 or so properties in primary producers, and we've got 70,000 residential. So the relative change is, I guess, it's a bit more exposed, I guess, when you start talking about primary producers, because there's fewer properties, but it's exactly the same way. And in each category, it can happen in your commercial, industrial, it can happen in your vacant land as well. But the key thing here, it's all relative to the other ratepayers within your category.
I guess, Anthony, it was good. Can you go back to that previous slide? That's a good example, I guess. Looking at the large rate increase for the orange person.
Yeah.
If we decided that we wanted to try and keep the size of these increases under control, where some of them were quite extreme, you could potentially be backing off a little bit on the orange one and putting the pink ones up a little bit more to create the total revenue for the sector.
Which is, Martin, is essentially what the proposed rebate would do. So if we were going to say cap this primary producer one here to a certain increase in their rates, the others would pick up the slack, so to speak. And that was one of the arguments that some elected members put up as to why we wouldn't cap, is because primary producer one had a significant increase in their valuation. The others have either had a reduction in their valuation, or it's remained the same, but relative to primary producer one, it's gone down. So would it be fair to ask them to contribute some of the rates that we would under our system expect primary producer one to contribute? And I guess that's almost the nub of the argument.
Is that problem that you've just raised about possible unfairness of that solution, but that happens anyway under the residential rate cap, does it?
Yes, it does. And we'll explore the impacts of the residential rate cap on other residential ratepayers, as well as looking at how that impacts other primary producer ratepayers as well, once we get into some of the slides. Okay, happy to move on. Yep. Just wanted to quickly just reinforce the fact that rates are not a fee for service. They are, and it's clearly stated in the Act that they are a tax. And because property valuations are used as a proxy or a way to determine how much tax or how much rates a different ratepayer pays, it's effectively a property tax. And there are 5 key principles of taxation that our policy actually strives to achieve. I just want to very quickly explore each of those. So the first one is around equity, and that's horizontal and vertical. So horizontal is make sure we've got an equitable system across categories, but also an equitable system within a category as well. So that's your vertical. So making sure that residential pays its fair share and primary producers pay their fair share, et cetera, but within those categories, each individual ratepayer is paying their fair share compared to other ratepayers within their category or relative to them. The second comment up there is benefit. And what that means is that a ratepayer will receive some benefit for the tax they pay, but not the entire benefit and all the time or at the same level. A really good example that we talked about in relation to this one was our state taxes and our federal taxes. Through those, we contribute to hospitals and the health system, but do we actually get back the same level of value by going to hospitals or our health system than we do in terms of what we contribute in any given year? The answer is no. However, it's nice to know that if we ever get sick or we ever need the use of a hospital, our taxes are paid to go towards it, and rates work in a similar way. Another good example that we talked about was defence. We pay a lot of our tax goes into our defence systems. And again, do I see any direct benefit from my taxes in how we support our defence industry? No. However, again, it's nice to know that if I guess we're ever in need of a defence, it's there for us. And it's very similar with that with rates. We build roads, we create footpaths, we create parks and libraries. Not everyone's going to use those equally at all the time, but there are different stages throughout your life, and there are different, I guess, reasons that you need some of their services at a time. They are there for you to use, but you will not always get a direct benefit for what you pay. And that's the key point to make around the fee for service.
I think the one difference here is in the case of defence, a lot of that money's in the toilet, but we won't talk about that.
Is in where, sorry?
Is in the toilet.
Okay. I'm not going to go there, but I'm not entirely sure what you're talking about, but I think I know what you're saying. The third point is ability to pay. So this is looking at someone's capacity to pay. Now, we don't get access to tax returns. We don't get access to personal income. So we need some basis to determine relatively what one person can afford to pay compared to another. And one of those is that we do have access to is valuations. So therefore, valuations serve, I guess, as a proxy for us for relative wealth. Again, it's not a perfect solution because we know that there are people on pensions and they get increases in their property valuation, but their revenue or income does not increase proportionately. However, given that we've got 80,000 ratepayers, we just need a fairly simple and easy to understand, I guess, system to do that, and valuations tends to be that way. So fair or unfair from time to time, but it's probably the best thing that we have to determine someone's relative capacity to pay compared to someone else.
Bit questionable for primary producer.
I think you
could have a prime. You and I discussed this before, Anthony. You could have a prime. You've got your three primary producers. One's making a great deal of income, a huge income out of their property, and yet he's paying the same rate as the other two primary producers that don't even use their properties for primary production.
Yeah. It's one of those things, Richard. You know, there's no one absolute fair system, I think, but it's the best we have to be able to cut the pie up. I'm happy to park that and come back to those, but I just want to keep moving through so that we actually get to the end of the session within a reasonable amount of time. Efficiency is another one, which is linked to behaviour. A simple example of that is our vacant land. We have that at a slightly higher rate in the dollar because we want to discourage land banking and encourage construction throughout our city. And simplicity is another one. It has to be understandable. So a simple structure such as our fixed component and our variable component, it's very easy for someone to be able to calculate what their rates are based on our system. So that's just recapping the rating process and the rates as a taxation. What I want to do now is get straight into some of the detail to start exploring some of the issues that have been raised by different people. Is everyone comfortable to keep moving? Yep. So the first thing is just wanted to put a slide up here to have a look at the relative proportion that each category pays of rates compared to the total property valuation. I've highlighted a couple here where residential is 86% of total property valuation within the city. It contributes around 85% of rates. Primary production is 4.8%. It contributes 4.2%. However, if we look at commercial industrial is 6.7% of total property valuation, but contributes 8.3% of our rates pie. And vacant land, I just spoke about that, how we try and create a disincentive to sit on the land. Again, 1.7% of total property valuation, 2.4% of rates. The key here is that rates payable are not proportionate to the percentage of property valuation, which reflects to some degree our use of differential rates. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yep.
Yep. I guess the only comment I want to make around this slide is if we're looking to generate more employment for the city, should we actually, in fact, as part of our rating review, be considering whether it's fair that commercial industrial are paying disproportionate amount of rates compared to their property valuation if we want to look at making it cheaper for them to do business and perhaps employ more, but it's something to consider at a later date.
Well, I guess the counter argument to that is the value of the land as a general rule, is commercial industrial a denser form of land use in terms of income from the land compared to primary production.
Yeah, and these are all the things that we will need to take into account, Martin, as we start to review our the way we rate going forward. And if that's fair, then that's fair. It's just something to point out. If we were to spread the rates burden based on property valuation, this is what it would look like for each category. So residential would be expected to contribute 1.5 million more, commercial industrial $2.1 million less, and so on. So that's just really, I guess, to highlight the fact that rates aren't aligned 100% to the way we value. However, we do use valuations within categories to split the pie. Excuse me. Next slide. I just want to look at how rates grew from one year to the next compared with valuation. So again, just focusing on primary production, total valuation grew by 11.2%, but we only grew rates by 2.1%. Again, based on the approach that the council took in terms of the way we split the pie and looked at the higher level of fixed. Each category obviously went up in valuation, 7.1%, but we only increased rate by 2.1% because we only take what we want. But I guess the stark thing here is the increase in primary production compared to its rates, and excuse me, the relative impact that will have within the category itself. Is there any comment on that?
I wonder whether the increase in valuations in primary production is due to properties that are used as lifestyle properties, and in a sense, their valuations almost reflect a residential influence on there.
I believe anecdotally it's probably driven by some of the wineries in the region.
Okay.
Look, the thing is, Martin, to have such large increase like that and some properties didn't increase, there are some significant moves on individual properties within that category. Sorry, I keep coughing. The next thing is someone, I think it might have been Martin or Richard, asked, what is the impact of rate capping on residential? So this year was the highest increase we've had for many years in terms of rate cap. We had about, I think, Justin, on average under $10,000 a year for the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the impact of the 10% rate cap. This year, because of the revaluation initiative, it was significantly higher. So 2,600 properties received some form of cap. So 2,600 properties increased, their rates increased by more than 10% from one year to the next. And the average rebate given to those properties was $75. That $194,000 then needed to be spread over the remaining properties. But given that there's actually 70,800 remaining properties, each of those remaining properties received $2.75 increase in their annual rates, an increase of 0.17%. So that shift definitely happens, but because of the larger numbers of properties that we're talking about, the impact on individual remaining ratepayers is not as significant. If we then look at the same impact for primary production that we have calculated, if we were to give a 10% rate cap on primary production, it just so happens to be very close to the same amount that we experienced this year for residential properties, 196,000. But the difference here is that 569 properties only, not 2,500, received in effect, would receive a benefit. And that benefit's about $344 per property, or 12% of the average rates. The other flip side of that is that there's only about 1,500 remaining properties that would have to bear the brunt or the spread of that 196, which means that of those 1,500 remaining properties would receive a $132 increase in their annual rates, a 5% increase. And so you can see the stark difference between capping residential, where every remaining property of almost 71,000 received a $2.75 annual increase. In primary production, because of the reduced numbers, there's a much larger rebate that would be provided under the 10% cap to a fewer number of properties, but even those remaining would actually receive a severe or a significant increase in their rates to compensate for those that were getting the rebate or the capping.
Anthony, is that just for that year, and then the next year it basically goes up to that same level, and then those people who have been affected actually it drops off?
Yeah, we tried to start thinking about that one to calculate it, but given that we expect there might be some more valuation fluctuations based on what's happening in the market at the moment, we couldn't actually even start to contemplate what that might mean. But if we get significant valuation increases again,
but in theory, if everything stayed the same, in theory, the following year, that $132 would be dropped back off of those properties, and the other properties would get the 344 fully on their property, because it's only capped for a year. Is that right? Everything else remains the same.
Yeah, but what that does, Wayne, is it sets the new base. So it would then have to be based on how those valuations increase or not in the following year, as to whether we would actually get any impact from rate capping at all. It's a bit theoretical, to be honest, because we don't know until we actually get the valuations in.
One thing that we've got to be mindful of, I think, too, is we get out there in the public and we're saying, look, we've capped rates at 1.2%. But we're not talking about, we're purely talking about residential. And I think that what we need to do is to ensure that we actually get the full information out to the community, so that industrial, commercial and primary producers are showing what they get. It's just a little bit misleading. Thanks.
I think it's, if I can just interrupt and add, I think it's really important in the language that we use, that we talk about, when we're talking about raising rates and we talk about rate increases each year, we're talking about the increase on the total pool or the total pie of rate revenue. So as Anthony showed, we increased our rates. We based it on CPI and we had a growth of 0.9%. So we increased our total pool by 2.1%. But the actual individual increases or decreases for individuals, no matter which sector they're from, can vary. And we saw within the residential as well that there were residents that had higher increases and there were residents that had lower increases on their rates compared to the previous year. So I think it's really important, and I agree with you, Jeff, that the messaging is important. We try to use the term rate revenue rather than rates, because while we're increasing the pool of rate revenue, what that actually means for individuals is then determined by a number of factors, of which property valuation is one of them.
I think the key point we just wanted to make here was that when we bring it back to you to consider whether we're going to rebate this year or not, there is a significant shift because of the numbers we're talking about. We then looked at the same thing for 20% capping, and that 196 number dropped significantly, and there's fewer properties that are receiving the benefit. However, we're still up around the $300 plus benefit that we're giving to those properties that have had much larger valuation increases compared to their neighbours, and the impact on remaining properties is less. However, there is still a significant benefit that people that have had large valuation increases are getting relative to the other rate payers within that category.
I guess, speaking hypothetically, if council had a mind to redress the situation that's already just come about, of course, we could look at the 20% rate cap and refund $98,000 to the relevant ratepayers. That would be a loss to council, because of course we don't have the ability to put everyone else's up 2%. That's just not going to happen. So, but personally, I think 20% is a very big increase, and I don't know what terminology to use, but above that, it starts to border on almost on unconscionable, possibly. I don't know. Probably that's the wrong word, but border on unreasonable. So, yeah.
I guess you then need to consider whether there are other categories in the residential and commercial industrial that have already had 20% increase as well, and where is the equity by providing it to one category and not others as well. So that's another consideration that I would think you'd have to make when we start to look at this.
Well, I'd be open to criticism on what I'm about to say, but land that is designated as primary production is a little bit unusual to any other form of land, in that people may have their house and live on it and just have a sheep or some cattle just to keep the grass down. They're paying primary production rates, but they're using it as just simply as a large residential property without the income potential being realised. Whereas with commercial and industrial, the assumption there is the rates are up a bit, but the assumption is that land is being fully utilised as best as the private enterprise owner can to generate capital.
Yeah, the flip side to that, from my perspective, Martin, is that the Valuer General sets that land use. So they have criteria that would need to be satisfied as to how they classify that. If that criteria is not being met, the ratepayer and the owner of the property has the ability to challenge that. Maybe we need to communicate that better as well. But that land use is set by the Valuer General. We ultimately adopt that, and we can change that based on receiving evidence to the effect that isn't the case. However, we don't end up getting a lot of those objections.
Yeah, and I guess other aspects to do with primary production are where the increases in that particular category particularly large relative to the others, and is it one of the more problematic because there's so few actual properties involved? And is there that small influence where creating the same revenue share becomes more difficult as primary production land gets rezoned into residential, or used as residential rather than primary production?
Look, we've got a couple of slides on that coming up, which will explore that a bit more as well, and it might give you a bit more insight as well once we see that.
Sorry, Anthony, just one thing I think we should all be mindful of is that if somebody receives a valuation which they think is extreme, that there is a process where they can approach the Valuer General to address that, and if they can demonstrate that something's not a primary production property, then the Valuer General will take that on board. And I think, from the challenge we have is that our rates are based on the Valuer General's valuation. And if the Valuer General's got it wrong, if the owner of the property believes the Valuer General's got it wrong, then it's a relationship they have to build with the Valuer General, and a process they have to go through there to resolve that matter. And I guess it concerns me a little bit that we're going to try to offset what somebody tells us is an over-the-top valuation. But meanwhile, in reality, I don't hear too many people saying they're unhappy to hear their primary production land's gone up in value.
No.
So, and I think there's a slide that'll come up that shows you exactly how many concerns and complaints there have been. So perhaps if we could move on, Anthony.
Yeah. Yep.
I guess the counter argument to what Scott just said is that a lot of this land, although it's been purchased as a place for somewhere to live, and they put a few cattle on it, nevertheless, it still would be primary production, but very low income density, if you like, for want of a better word, for the amount of land and the the rates being paid.
The story, just a quick comment, what we're doing here also is that we're considering decreasing the rate for those people that are making quite a good amount of money out of their primary production land. So in fact, we're considering decreasing their rate to increase their income. I'm not quite sure whether that's fair to the other ratepayers, as Martin perhaps said, that are prime producer and just using their backyard as because of the environment they wish to live in.
I think you're correct, Richard, in that if we go down this path, there will be people that are receiving a benefit that actually don't need it.
Yeah,
and there may be some people that do, but there definitely will be people who've had a windfall in terms of their property valuation for one reason or another, and they will be getting a benefit as well.
Yeah, that's the difficulty. There are people who have suffered greatly under these valuation changes, who effectively are using it as a residential primary production property versus high intensity agriculture, which possibly generating the income to support it.
Yeah, that's potentially also comes down to lifestyle choice as well, Martin. I don't want to sound too harsh, but people choose to do that as well, I think. So there's a lot to balance here.
Oh yeah, look, I agree with you on that. I do agree. I guess the difficulty is when people are trapping along, they try and budget for expectations, and then the sort of increases that have happened here are a bit problematic, that's all.
Yeah.
I think the other way to look at it, just the final thing I'll say on this, the other way to look at it is that if their property value has increased significantly through this revaluation initiative, which was effectively a catch-up of property values, does that mean that their property was undervalued for a number of years, and therefore there's been a benefit that's been gained in previous years by not having to pay as much rates as they now are?
Oh, look, that's true, but they wouldn't necessarily have thought of it in those terms. It's a lot of these issues around increasing values of properties is a good thing, we say, but if you sell it, you've got to buy another one, and the increase in property values is not necessarily meaningful if you're not intending to sell it, I guess.
Yeah. Look,
well, what brought this about, of course, was a resident in our ward, Marion's and mine, that had an increase the previous year due to the reduction in the number of primary producers. And we were getting out again saying we brought in a 0 rate increase. And then, of course, this year we talk about our 1.2% increase, where they got whammed again because of the increase in their capital value. And from my observations, the individual who's a retiree that's probably not using the property for primary production in the general sense, are there still tax concessions that they get from being primary producers?
Justin, I think, are you able to provide some sort of response there in terms of, reduced registrations and range of other benefits?
Yeah, sure. Look, I guess we only really can speak for obviously what we provide, but yeah, I do understand there's obviously other benefits. I guess the main point is if a prime producer is impacted by how they're using the land, there are opportunities to discuss that with the Valuer General, and they can take that into consideration in regards to the value. So I take Scott's point. If someone's quite dissatisfied with the value that's been applied to the land, the right course of action, in my opinion, is that they take that up with the Valuer General.
Yeah, well, that's a separate issue, though. I mean, they may take that up, and the Valuer General may say, well, it's not being used intentionally, but it is still prime production land, and given all the other valuations, it stands. So in a way, yes, it's related. In another way, it's another matter between the Valuer General and the property owner. I guess the concern is these quite eye-watering rate increases in this particular sector, and could it be managed better?
All right. Look, I
guess, like I said, there are opportunities for prime reduction to have things such as notional values applied and things like that, and they are applied across the sector. They're not something that council apply, but certainly there can be reductions achieved through the Valuer General. And I guess the other thing to be reminded here of is, I guess, if we were to cap, the people who are not seeing an increase are funding the capital increase of someone's value in property. So that might be something else worth considering.
But I think
So for those people that haven't had an increase, they're contributing to the ones that are seeing an increase.
Yeah, look, I think we've actually explored this quite a bit. I'll keep moving, but I'm happy to have discussion with anyone after we get off this session. The next one is starting to look at what's been raised a little bit tonight. Is this, what is the effect of having fewer primary producer ratepayers? Like I said, unless we get significant shifts in numbers, we try and keep those pie proportions the same. However, if we look at the facts, in 2021-22, the number of ratepayers in the primary production category reduced by 18 from 2071 to 2053. Just if we assume that we hold the total rate revenue that we expect from those that category at 5.7 million, so this is the 21-22 rates we're generating. If we assume in the current year there's 20,053 ratepayers, a reduction of 18, they're paying 2,787 on average. If we had the same number of ratepayers as last year, contributing the same amount, they would be paying $2,762. The increase we are talking about, because of the reduction in numbers, is $25 per ratepayer.
I guess
less than 1%.
The problem with that argument, Anthony, and I'm not sure how good I am at maths, but the problem with that argument is if your reduction in the number of primary production properties occurs because some significant properties are turned into residential developments, I can see it as a possibility that you're actually reducing some relatively high value properties. So you're taking out of the system few properties, but a more significant chunk of rates than the numbers would indicate. And so therefore the increase for the remaining ratepayers may actually be more than the average.
Yeah, so we'll explore that in a moment, Martin. But the key point here is there's not the significant impact that some members of the community are suggesting by having less primary production, particularly in the current year. If we had,
I take your point on the average, yes.
Yeah.
But the average may not tell the actual story as yet.
Yeah.
I'll just ask a question.
Yes.
In relation to the 18 reduction, and we're assuming it's because, well, land's being developed, is it also not true that some primary producers are purchasing their neighbouring property?
Scott's nodding. With his background, I'd assume he'd have a bit of insight into that. But also, it could also be that they've been reclassified as well.
It's all proportional to your acreage, your income, and I'd imagine that some of those 18 would have been absorbed by a neighbouring primary producer.
Yeah, Richard. Well, I think they've got another slide a bit later which shows a couple of examples where Councillor Bray is right that some have turned into residential. But you're also correct. There'd be quite a few of that 18, which is less than 1%, that would have in fact been amalgamated properties. I mean, I'm aware of some of the viticultural properties in McLaren Vale, for example, which are just, they change hands and they're amalgamated. They're amalgamated in. Some would stay as separate rateable properties, and some wouldn't, depending on the business model of the organisation. So. Either way you look at it, though, the statements that have been made to us that there's been a significant decrease in properties, I just don't think it stacks up.
Yeah, just on that amalgamation of properties, I would think it's quite possible that when an adjoining landowner buys a property, you still have two property entities that they own that may attract the same rates anyway. I mean, if you had two adjacent
and again, that will all depend on the use of the property and the sort of agricultural practice that goes into it. But any way you look at it, the fact that 18 out of 2,071, you're not seeing a massive decrease in primary production properties on that basis. I mean, it is absolutely nothing like what would be going on in Northern Adelaide, and areas sort of to the west of Gawler, for example.
Okay. The next slide looks at the other example that Councillor Bray raised was, I think at one of the deputations we received, there was an example given of a 30-hectare site and a 40-hectare site being converted over to 393 and 644 residential allotments. So what we want to do is have a look at what does that actually mean. So again, if we take the current year's rate revenue from primary production of 5.7 million, and we have 2,053 properties the year before at that average, and we've got 2,051 now. Not sure that's correct. Oh yes, sorry. Soon we've got 2,053 properties, and we're converting 2 of those over to residential. So we've got 2 less primary production properties. The impact on the average rates is $3 per ratepayer. If we then have a look at the residential rate revenue for the current year, which is 116 million, and we assume that we get close to 1,100 new properties as a result of those, which, by the way, is higher than the total growth of the city in a year, which is around 800 or 900 properties. But let's assume that we get every one of those properties becomes a ratepayer in the current year. We'd find that overall there'd be a reduction of $22 per ratepayer. So again, this was put up in the deputation as quite a significant impact on both the primary producers, but also it would have a significant impact in terms of the rate pie and how we break it up. But the numbers just don't bear out in that regard.
That's
And like I said, that assumes that 1,037 new properties, they all hit us in 1 year, but they would be developed in stages, so we would get them over time as part of the growth of the city. So again, this $3 might happen in 1 year, but this $22 will happen over years. The numbers just don't bear out with the, I don't want to use the word sensational, but those statements that would suggest that these are significant impacts.
Yeah, I guess we're still talking averages here. If the 2 properties that were sold and removed from the primary production list were very big, very valuable properties, I can see potentially your averages might be a bit more than $3. Would that be possible?
I'd have to have a bit of a think about that, Martin, and run some numbers.
Yeah, because when you're talking averages, I mean, it's possible if for example one of those 2 properties was bringing in, for argument's sake, rate revenue of $2 million, then once you remove that from the sector, of course, the average increase per ratepayer would have to be quite a lot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's possible. We'd have to have a look at what sort of rates they would bring in to be able to do that more specifically.
So,
but
I mean,
it's not a bad point.
That the total argument really depends on the significance of the reduction in primary production properties hinges on whether that reduction is some of the biggest rate generating properties.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. If those reductions related back to the average, I think this holds true. If not, we'd actually have to do a little bit more analysis. But again, Martin, I don't think it's going to be the significant number that has been alluded to.
No, yeah, I take your point. It may just be a contributing pressure, and we can't be sure how big that pressure is, I guess.
Correct. Yep. The next thing we were asked to, or has been raised a couple of times, and this is, I really want to open this one up to discussion rather than me speaking to it a lot, but it's more how how can we compare primary producer rates across councils? So we've had it said that, you know, Alexandrina do this and Mount Barker do that, and Adelaide Hills have this rate. The thing is, it is really difficult to compare rates across councils because each council has a different makeup. Each council has a different rating basis. Some councils have a different contribution from each land category. For example, Alexandrina have a much higher proportion of primary producers than we do. There are different types of primary production, you know, grazing versus vineyards, and how does that play out in terms of valuations? The point is here, I don't have a silver bullet to 100% prove why you can't compare them. I just have, there are all these different bases. Some councils have a fixed charge like we do, some don't. Some have a minimum rate, some don't. How do you ever get your apples for apples across the councils? And that's the thing, that it's easy for someone to throw up at us that this council primary production rates are this rate in the dollar compared to ours, but there are so many other competing factors that it's not that easy just to very simply say why that one is higher without actually breaking down every component of every basis and the way councils or different councils rate. So I'm just looking for some comments or questions around that. But like I said, there's no silver bullet here. There's just lots of questions around why it's difficult.
I agree. I take your point. I guess we come back to the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that primary production properties have had some significant rate increases. And for some people in that sector, for example, the retired person on acreage, and the rate increase, which was quite extreme, could actually represent a very significant part of their disposable income for the year. Yes, it's I don't know whether we have some, whether we can introduce some mechanisms to consider situations like that when rate increases get above 20%. Can we look at the intensity of agriculture in terms of income on the property on a case-by-case basis, where people can apply to have a reduction? I'm sure that a case-by-case reduction would cost us a lot less than just blanket doing the whole sector as a rate ceiling. But gee, look, anything above 20% for somebody who's not intensively farming would be pretty extreme.
If you're a primary producer, does it effectively mean you're a business? I mean, you know, a retired person can claim themselves to be a primary producer without actually producing anything. Is that the case?
Yeah. Justin, I'm going to try and throw to you on this one, so hopefully you can help me out. But I imagine the Value General has an objective series of criteria that it uses to determine what the land use is. I can't answer that 100% accurately.
Yep. So a couple of years ago, we added a definition in the rating policy around primary production. And basically comes out of the Valuation Act, and it's in the conduct of business, and it comes down, and look, don't quote me for each one. It's agriculture, horticulture, pasturage, you know, cattle, and it basically lists off all the different sort of, it's considered the business of. So the Valuer General will look at that and go, is that the business of? Now, if someone is generally retired and is not using that land, there have been instances where they've said, look, this is just a great big park, especially the small acreages, and they have it reclassified to residential land, as Councillor Pete has mentioned a couple of times, on some smaller parcels. So, you know, generally, you know, the Valuation Act sort of determines for the Valuer General when they sort of recommend that land use to council.
I think the key point is that there is a basis for why the Valuer General determine a certain land use.
I noticed there, Anthony, in relation to different rates for prime production, e.g. grazing versus vineyards, I guess that gets back to my point about that being relative to income.
Justin,
there's not actually a different rate within the category.
I imagine someone's basing the fact that perhaps vineyards are bringing a greater income than primary production at the moment, such as grazing. and I guess Alexandrina Council or someone is viewing their rate applicable to that.
So just for context, that was added in. So on Coringa, we don't have a different rate in the dollar for grazing versus vineyards, for example, but the composition of what can be comprised as primary production can vary across different councils. So within Onkaparinga, more of our primary production land could be classified as being vineyards, and therefore, the property valuations are higher, whereas some other councils, they might have more or less primary production land, but it might be grazing and therefore a reduced value compared to what we've got. So the reason that that's in this slide is just to demonstrate the differences in defining primary production across different councils and how it's difficult to compare them against across the different councils.
Yeah, I think if I could just add a couple of things here. So different types of primary production, that's the easiest thing to conceptualize, I guess, grazing versus vineyards. But even then you'd go, well, okay, but it depends where the vineyard is, what's its current state of management and repair, what are they growing there, is there demand for it? If you had Shiraz in McLaren Vale, Barossa and Langhorne Creek, you had 10 hectares of it, it'd still all be worth something different. And then you look at grazing, well, you can be running, sheep, or you could be running, prime beef on the same property. The business is going to be worth a different amount. So, I think this is where the idea that, we have had said to us, well, down in a certain council, this is what they charge. You go, well, that, it's just not comparable. And it's an easy thing. It's a throwaway line, but the reality is quite different. There was a comment made before, I think it was Councillor Olsen, sorry, I can't see you on my screen, about, well, are they a business? The answer is, well, if their tax return says they are a primary producer, then they're a business. And I'm sure the Valuer General would look at, or if they didn't, if there was a question, that's what they would look at, is are you actually claiming you're a primary producer?
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. That was me. And so there are tax benefits to be claimed as a primary producer. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So these people are choosing to be primary producers because there's tax benefits in it.
I think it'd be reasonable. Reasonable to say no one's forced them to be a primary producer.
Yeah.
What's the situation with the person in Clarendon, I wonder, Jeff? Is that person a retired person and running cattle to keep the grass down and not a business, or?
Well, I get my response to that would be, well, they could well be, but again, if they're claiming it, from a tax perspective to be a primary producer, whether they're running 5 head of cattle or 5,000 head of cattle, they're claiming to be a viable, they're not claiming to be a business, and they're claiming the tax breaks accordingly. So again, that's not something that we control, and that's a lifestyle and it's a business choice. But if they're claiming that those tax exemptions, being a primary producer, then it would be fair and reasonable for the Valuer General to declare their property to be a primary production property. If they're not, then if I was them, I'd be raising it with the Valuer General.
Yeah, well, I guess we need a bit more background on that specific case to understand what's going on, because I think I know the property, and it's certainly, regardless of how they're reusing it, you would classify it as primary production land, even if they're not a business and just running a few cattle on it. So in
perspective, what was there? 2,700 properties, and we've had 3 complaints.
2,071.
2,053 for this year. It was 2,071 last year.
3 complaints. So I mean, how much are we going to spend on doing all this? I mean, investigating one person's property on, I think you've got to put it in perspective in some respect.
I agree. the approach I would take would be to say, well, in some situations, increases above 20% could be very problematic. Are there criteria we should look at to assist people that fall above that 20% who can demonstrate that it's not an increase that they can
So
manage?
Martin, playing devil's advocate on that, what if, I won't name a wine company, but what if a large Australian wine company gets some significant increase in their property valuation because they've had a good year or something? Why would they then not get the same benefit to someone else if they could prove that the 20% increase was harsh? I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, I take your point, but in that situation, you'd be looking at the increase in terms of whether they were successful or not in business. You'd be looking at the increase as a percentage of overall revenue. So I guess looking at exemptions above the 20%, I'd be thinking in terms of properties that were not used with the intention of making a living off them. And the other criteria could be whether people are retired or not, I guess. So, or part retired. So it's
yeah. Well, if people are prepared to share that information with us, it's something that we can look at. But people are generally reluctant to share that, to be honest.
well, that's if they
Well,
are.
I just think we
Therefore we have to assume that they. Sorry, Richard.
I just think we allow, as Wayne said, those three to go back to the Valuer General and test whether they can reclassify their land. But I make it quite clear, and I've said this before, why would you go to the Valuer General to decrease the price of your asset? I mean, in the long term, these same people want to return and sell it in time or pass it on to the next of kin, and that's value, that's an asset. Why would you go and have it devalued? Unless it's really applicable. So if these people are really serious about it, then test the Valuer General department first and have the property reclassified.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that the property is over or undervalued. The value might be pretty well spot on. I guess when you're talking about increases above 20%, if it's not being used as a business and the people are retired, I mean, you wouldn't expect people to provide this information anyway, but if we had a policy which said that we'd be prepared to look at a couple of strict criteria, then we may get a handful of people who are in difficulty in a sense of unreasonable increases, and we can adjust those ones based on some criteria that as a council possibly we've got the ability to put into place to sort out.
Martin, we do have the hardship policy that will deal with that. So if the increase in their rates gets to a point where it becomes difficult for them to maintain those payments, we do have mechanisms in place to help them through that.
Well, I don't want to go anywhere near that, because in this context, I don't like that at all. I understand hardship policies, but all they're doing is putting the hardship off for another day. What I'm talking about is a situation where I understand if people don't want to put a ceiling on the increase because of the difficulties it creates. I understand it works okay in residential. I understand it might not work in primary production quite so well. So maybe a more flexible approach for primary production, bearing in mind that these could be very successful businesses who could afford it, but maybe just in the case of primary production, we can take into account the unusual situation where Broadacre sometimes is just being used as a residential property, and sometimes people don't have incomes to support these increases. And in which case, if they fit some strict criteria, we can simply rebate them the amount above 20%. Still pay the 20%, but possibly we can look after these handful of cases and create a sort of a more even situation, I guess.
Councillor Bray, one option that the ratepayers would have would be to go back to the VG and apply for a notional value. I can't talk to the details of what a notional value is. I'm only just getting my head around it, but I do believe that that is looking then at how the property is being used. So if in effect it is like a large residential property and not being used for the purposes of generating primary production income,
Okay.
the Valuer General will take that into consideration and therefore apply a notional value, which is then our basis for rating.
Well, has that been done in these 3 cases? Have we suggested those people do that?
So yes, communication has been made with those ratepayers to say that they have that option to do that. Yes.
So what's
and I also advised the chap that came in and did that deputation that night on the same subject, that he had the ability to do that with his 84 hectares.
Yeah.
So what's the? I almost wonder, should we have got back to these people and said, have you done it? What's the outcome before we even do all this? What we're doing now? Maybe we should understand these difficult situations better before we start to look at these issues.
Yeah, so there have been ongoing conversations since the report went up to council about these options.
So do we have an outcome for those 3 people yet?
I don't believe we do.
I guess the difficulty I have with all of this is that we are trying to fit a system of taxation or rating for a larger body, trying to take into account 3 individual circumstances. I think we need to, as an organisation, actually set our policy that generally fits the intention of what we're doing, but we still do have the ability, I think, to look at these things individually, Councillor Bray, without actually changing the whole way we rate for 3 people.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm simply suggesting we have a set of policies around rating. One of them is a 10% ceiling on increases for residential, and that works for residential. Primary production, which is an unusual one where the land may be used as residential, leaving aside people could get it reclassified, but just leaving that aside for a minute. I mean, it's not impossible to have a set policy applicable to anyone who's in that situation, where we give consideration to those who are using the land as residential and who are retired. I mean, you can choose to have a policy, and if nobody uses it, doesn't matter. If a couple of people do, well, then maybe we can help them out. As elected members, our role is to, I guess, is to try and find solutions for those odd situations where people can be badly impacted. The role of staff is to run the council, which they do really well, bring in the money and get the job done. Our role as elected members, I view it as trying to find some innovative solutions for the odd people which fall through the cracks.
Anthony,
perhaps
can I ask a question about this slide?
Yeah.
So are you saying in that, I'm a little bamboozled by the numbers, but and the code you're using, but basically you're saying if you're a genuine primary producer, you can actually get a tax deduction from your rates, which you've said assume a 25% deduction. Do we know what the deductibility of it is?
Look, the company tax rate these days is 25%, and rates are considered an input into the business, a cost, and therefore they would form part of the operating cost base that you can claim your tax against. So this is, I went to this slide because I think it was Councillor Olsen that picked up on it, that currently if we look at our rate and the dollar charged from primary producer residential, it is 1.18 to 1 ratio. However, if you are even generating $1 of revenue and you are claiming that you're running a business there, you can get a tax deduction for all your costs that go into running that business, of which rates is one. On that component, if you're getting a 25% tax deduction, your effective rate in the dollar is actually 0.88 to 1. So you're actually better off than residential.
Okay, can we just move on? I know you've got a few more slides. I'm just aware of time when we might want to have a bit of a discussion at the end. So I'm just conscious that we're not going to get there?
I'm going to go to the next slide first, and I'll come back to this one quickly. So again, this is just picking up on what Wayne was saying. We've had 3 complaints from 2,053 ratepayers, which is 0.15% of the total the total population within the primary producers. The other interesting thing is the Valuer General have had lower objections than usual across the state in the current year. So they've had 976 in November 2021, which is the period in which they expect everyone to lodge their objections, versus 1,300 for the entire last year. And they're expecting 2,000 as a result of the revaluation initiative. So I guess the key point there is the problem isn't, I was going to use really bad, isn't endemic across the whole of the whole of the primary producer sector or the whole of the city, in terms of the impact that that's had. That's all I want to say about that.
That's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to finish on just an open discussion with everyone about, like, why do primary producers, or is it only just these 3 that we're worrying about? Why do they feel like they're not getting value for their rates?
I think it's the only the 3.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm not even sure why we're having all these conversations at the moment, because I think it'd be valuable to have seen whether those 3 can get their land use changed, and to see whether that's the solution to these problems. Trying to work out a policy to assist these people would seem to be the step after determining that the Valuer General looks at their land and says, well, I know you're just using it as residential, it's not a business, but it's pretty big. You keep a few cattle on it to keep the grass down, which you sell to supplement your retirement. So unfortunately, no, I'm going to have to keep this as a primary production, in which case they've got the problem. So I guess really we need to know what's happened with these 3 before we can go about.
So
Can I make a comment about this? If we proceed with the current rate formula, can we put in a clause or resolution that is retrospective? So then if these 3 clients or whoever primary producer do go to the Valuer General and they do have their properties reclassified, devalued, whatever it is, that we allow them a rebate accordingly. So we pass on the current formula, but we have a retrospective resolution in there for these 3, or perhaps in a few more.
Yeah, look, I'm going to get Justin to respond to this, but I don't think we need the resolution, because if the Valuer General revalues these properties, we would then rate them accordingly on that, and we would give them a rebate without needing a resolution, Richard.
Okay.
Is that correct, Justin?
Yep, you're spot on.
When I was
So
talking,
the Valuer General was to object, 100% we would correct it back to what it was corrected to. So look, the objections for the year they always had a period of time to object. So we would need to check with those 3 in that status, because obviously there's conversation between the ratepayer and the VG.
yeah, part of the explanation I've tried to provide was that, you know, you might have 2 primary producers living on 4 or 5 kilometres of roadway, compared to 400 residential properties in a similar sort of an area. So it's about those delivery of services to the rural area. But of course, you know, they come back and say, well, we didn't need fortnightly pick up of green bins either. Anyway, we'll leave that. That's another bit.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Thanks for bringing that up, Jeff. The key reason for this slide was the fact that we often get an argument that primary producer and ratepayers don't get the same level of service that the metro part of our city does. So it was just really wanting to understand whether that's something that ratepayers bring to your attention, elected members, or not, or whether it's something we need to spend more time on. But, you know, for example, I think Jeff just hit the nail on the head a little bit. There's, along any particular rural road, there's only a few contributing ratepayers, but there's still the work to be done to maintain those roads. Obviously, it's less efficient to pick waste up, but those ratepayers still have access to all our other services. They might have a little bit further to travel, but they still get access to them. So this is more about whether there's any discussion here around the benefit that they're getting. It's something that Councillor Brown raises from time to time, so it's a pity that she wasn't able to make it tonight. But it's just something we can park it for now, but it's something just to keep in the back of our minds.
Where do we go from here? Do we need to get answers from these people and find out whether in fact the solution to this issue is reclassification because it's hitting particularly hard people who are using the land as residential and happen to be retired or something?
I might try to answer that. I think it'd be very useful for us to reach out to those three individuals and ask them what their current status is on that. I mean, that issue might have been resolved. If not, okay, well then we look at it.
So maybe we don't actually need to do anything at all until staff get back in touch with us councillors and say, well, we've looked at the three people and this is our understanding of how things sit with the Valuer General. Have a talk to the Valuer General. Maybe staff could even talk to the Valuer General and about these three cases on the basis of being test cases, because it's an important issue that we need to understand.
One other thing that we could consider is just a bit of a comparison of properties valued the same in residential compared to primary production and give an idea of what the rates are. I know that in this particular case, the individual was the one that I was dealing with and Marion was dealing with was probably paying about 900 or less a year more than what I'm paying on my property. So that'd be an interesting comparison to actually be able to do to see if these properties worth double the amount of time. Be just another way.
Yeah. Look, I've got to say, I'm not sure where this leaves us exactly, because there was a suggestion that we should be considering rebates. The council resolution subsequently said they want us to explore it. The three properties that we're talking about, we can deal with them during the normal course of business anyway, in the same way that's being suggested tonight. We can listen to them. We can actually help them make contact with the VG. We can actually work them through that. So that understanding the status of that, I agree, is something that can help us inform, but I don't think it helps us with the broader issue that's been raised around whether we should be rebating or not over a certain amount for primary producers. We would, in the normal course of business, work with these three ratepayers to understand their concerns.
But if the DG doesn't revalue, then it needs to come back to us and say, well, there wasn't a solution to classifying the property. So how can our policies be adjusted to make sure that people in very difficult situations like the one we've been hypothesising can have a policy in place for primary production where they not running a business.
And certainly when we're getting our message out to the community, I think we need to be very careful about saying, well, look, we've only brought in a 1.2% increase this year when we're talking about residential. So I think we need to be a little bit broader in it, because it does end up saying it's the primary producers versus the residentials, and they don't necessarily look at the increase in property values. They just see that 1.2%.
Oh, look, I agree with you, Jeff, but I think in the case of the fellow in Clarendon, these people understand that. They're simply saying that just due to circumstances, the rate increase they've been presented with is really just over the top. And there should, I guess their argument, as I understand it, would be there should be some mechanism to keep that under somewhat better control, I suppose. I mean, I don't know whether, Anthony, in the future, do we think about a 20% primary production increase cap? It's got a lot of disadvantages, so I don't know.
Martin, I'd like to think that once the Valuer Generals had this catch up over the last 3 to 5 years, I'd like to think that the 20% increases are going to be a rarity moving forward. But I mean, I can't guarantee that, obviously. But one of the other things that we were going to look at when we bring the report back to council was to actually consider whether we actually do away with capping on residential as well, because in the last few years, like I said, it's been around $10,000 a year. We had 196,000 or 194 this year, simply because we had those large fluctuations from the revaluation initiative again. So I think as part of any rating policy going forward, I think we need to look at the whole mix about whether we retain capping at all. Again, at the end of the day, that's council's decision, not ours, and we'll provide the advice and the information to support any decision around that. But rate capping has not been an issue in residential for some time now, apart from this year where we had the
got to be careful of using the term rate capping. We mean increase capping.
capping
The
rate increases to 10%, individual rate increases to 10%. Yep.
Yeah, I know that across the city in residential, there'll be many, many people who budget very tightly and put their money aside for rates. So I can definitely see the benefit of the 10% cap on rate increases.
But it really hasn't been required for the last 3-4 years until the revaluation initiative. That's the only point I want to make there.
Yeah, but there's always the odd circumstance, I suppose, and if you keep, it's not generally required. On the odd one or few cases it is. It may be very important to those people. I don't know.
So in wrapping up, we'll find out what's happening with those three properties. We'll touch base with them. We will consider if it's possible to look at how we may put something down in terms of a process in dealing with these people that I guess are in a particular situation with their primary production properties and whether they are truly primary production or not. The third one is, I guess we are obliged to bring a report back to council. I think that was part of the resolution, to actually deal with the rate capping, with the capping of increases in individual rates from one year to the next. But we'll look at those two other actions first, with a view to seeing where that leads us. But also we still need to deal with the resolution that's in front of us to deal with the rebates around rate capping. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yeah, I guess so.
Yep. I'll just make a comment in relation to Councillor Brown's comment, and you put on that slide about what value a prime producer is getting. I can't talk for other elected members, but down this way, I get copped in the neck by normal residential ratepayers who say, you know, I haven't got curbing, I haven't got a footpath, I don't use the rec centre or the library. So it's not a matter of being able to pick and choose what services we want or use. That's just tax. So yeah, I don't agree with this other business about, well, I don't agree with that line, that's all.
I'm with you on that one, Richard. I agree. Good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could, I guess that's why the heading was, well, who's subsidising who, because, you know, we often hear that one group's subsidising another, but even just the discussion that Jade, Anthony, self, we were having around these slides, you know, you can keep throwing up examples of one group subsidising another until you sort of step back from it and you say, well, it's, as Anthony pointed out in his slides, this is a form of taxation, and it depends on where you are, when you're there, and, you know, what stage of your life you're at, all sorts of different things as to whether or not you're using any or all of these facilities that council offers the community. Even your location, it'll change. So you know, there's really no answer to this, because at a point in time we're all in a different space. Well, but it is interesting that people will say, well, there's 400 people along one road, so clearly that road's cheaper to maintain, and you go, well, not necessarily so, but possibly so.
Yeah, look, I guess the issue that threw this up, let's find out from those three people if it really was an issue of a lot of pain because they're residential rather than primary producers in the way they use their land, and let's see whether reclassification is actually the appropriate solution.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree. Look, just I guess before we end, and Anthony's final slide, I think it would be worth at some point us having a further discussion about the concept of rate capping, only because, and I'm happy to stand corrected on this, but my recollection of when we were finalising the approach last year to rates, we did have a discussion around rate capping and at what level, etc., for residential. And as Councillor Bray has pointed out, for good reason. But we've got some time in the first quarter of next year to a calendar year to actually just think about this in a little bit more depth. And we might very well land on keep it exactly as it is. But I always feel that discussion is rushed just before we get to the budget and we get to setting the rates approach. We have a very quick discussion about, well, you know, what about rate capping for residential? Well, what about for the other sectors, etc. And I think if we've got some time here, even if it's just to reiterate that we support the existing policy, I think a discussion around that could be very useful for us.
I think you need to be very careful here and call it rate increase capping, because that's very easily confused with the broader concept of rate capping. So
yes,
need to watch that, I think.
Yep, that's a good point.
Okay.
and I guess if there's anything else associated with rates too, you know, think of it now, but if you do think of something, please, you know, let Anthony know, and let's have the discussion sort of early in the new year rather than something coming up in sort of May, end of May, when we're trying to finalise everything. We actually racked our brains around that. We couldn't think of anything else, but yeah, there might be something that you think, yeah, we should be discussing that as well.
Well, it's a complex area, but it's one where I think in the time I've been on this council, the bread and butter stuff of raising the rates and setting things is something that the staff have always done pretty consistently, and based on the pressure for changes, must have been doing it pretty well too.
Well, I'd have to just say in response, the level of complaints when you look at it are very, very low in terms of the number of rateable properties. And if nothing else, that might be a bit of a test in terms of, well, how does the community think about what we're doing?
I think the community must be pretty happy with the way the staff do their job. The complaints about the size of rates per se, the community sensibly directs those at elected members where those complaints belong. The administration of the system, I think, is run extremely well.
I'll just make
That's a good note to end on.
I make a comment, Anthony, on one of those slides you showed there that 40 hectares of land up north, I guess Freeling or something like that, housed 644 homes. It must be incredible infill, because if you double that to 80 hectares, that means it would take almost 1,300 homes. And yet we're screaming blue murder down here that the 80 hectares of Aldinga development, we don't want to see over 1,000 homes.
Yeah, rule of thumb when I used to be in development was if you're doing 600 square metre lots, it's almost like 10 to the hectare. So they're significantly smaller, like you point out.
Significantly smaller. They're down to 150 square metre. Yeah. Anyway, just an observation. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Look, it was a really good discussion. We'll follow through on those couple of actions, and then, like Scott said, in the new year, we'll bring back and have another session on, particularly on the capping of annual increase in rates, Councillor Bray.
Yes, with special focus on primary production.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to end.